So at the end of chapter one, you were presented with a question and basically asked, wait, but aren't there real differences between men and women on that gender binary? And this chapter is attempting to answer that by defining first what's meant by difference, then what's meant by men and women, and then what's meant by real, as in significant or meaningful when it comes to difference. So we're going to go over all of those. We'll focus on the different definitions of difference and some of the ideas surrounding similarities. And you'll notice that I'm not going to go and explain every single example because there are so many in this chapter. There are so many examples and looking at genetics, looking at research, looking at biology and hormones and things like that. And so it's already fully loaded with content. And so instead, this is just a highlight video. And so please make sure that you go back into those readings and I will put in a couple of little highlights on the slides to emphasize the ones that I really want you to pay attention to in your textbook. So if you haven't yet read chapter 2 of the text, go back and do that because it is amazingly vivid and descriptive and convincing. It's so persuasive and laying out the argument for how, if we're looking at the binary, how human men and women are more similar than different, especially when we're comparing them on the spectrum of sexual dimorphism among species. So go back and look at those examples that are given from nature. Go if you need to take a moment, spiral a bit and look those things up because they are just like awe-inspiring. And then think about that. Think about how in reality, physically, phenotypically, right? Speaking, we're not all that different from one another. Humans are actually way more similar than they are different when you're comparing us to other animals. And uh, when we're looking at like differences overall, it's really complicated and complex. Um, and so the text returns to these examples from different species throughout. Um, and also at the same time returns to another example specifically found in table 2.1 in chapter 2, where they're using a data set of 12 million people, right? A sample size of 12 million people across 21,000 measures of 386 traits in order to answer this question about men and women on this spectrum again, being different. And the majority of the variables, I love this, 85% of the variables fell under either that the differences between men and women across these 386 traits are negligible to non-existent or small, right? And so the average difference fell into the small category. And this is across a huge range of variables, right? And all of these showing like 85% no evidence of difference. And so I suggest you go back to that reading again and maybe look at some of the variables that they list as having no difference, right? And so take a look at that, see if you're surprised by any, and see if um, you see any that like go against our conventional wisdom or common sense or the norm of our society, right? Um, Another thing I want to introduce you to right now is this concept in sociology. We talk about reality versus perceived reality, and how we often think that, especially when it comes to science, that what we're learning is absolute truth and reality. And it's probably a bit more fair to refer to it as perceived reality. That means that we're seeing something, we're actually observing something that is real, um, or there is real, there are real variables or real clues that are hinting at something, but we're always perceiving them through a lens. And that lens can be our society, our culture, our experiences growing up, our communities, our socialization. right? And so a perception of reality and reality are not always the same, and often they aren't. So even when we're talking about, answering a question about gender differences um, between men and women, we got to pick that question apart because it's not something that you can easily say, okay, here's our objective analysis of it, right? Because there's always an angle, right? We are humans doing research about humans, right? And so, unfortunately, our humanity leads to us not being objective, well, not 100%, even when it comes to what seems like true scientific research. And so, you're going to get some examples of what this looks like as we look at these four definitions for defining difference that are coming. Okay, so we have four definitions for difference that we're going to be using to define difference between women and men. So the first definition here is that gender differences are real if we can measure them. And there is some really strong criticisms of this argument. One is, as a sociologist, I'm a big supporter of this criticism, and that is that we can't really truly study human beliefs, behaviors, and interactions as humans with beliefs, behaviors, and interactions of our own in a purely, absolutely objective way, right? There's so many things that get into our way, whether intentionally or unintentionally. So even when we have a completely structured and objective effort towards a test or a study, we can still see that people end up being influenced or motivated to be dishonest. One of the examples that's given in your text is priming. And so, sociologically speaking, we might describe this more as leading, right? And so, in some way, whether directly or directly, whether intentionally or inadvertently, you have reminded a study subject of something, maybe a stereotype that influences their responses, right? So the example that's given in your text is the stereotype, right? Reminding subjects of a stereotype, maybe in an example or in a question and how it's worded, or even a question that you think is completely unrelated, like what is your gender identity, or something like that. You could be inadvertently priming that uh, that subject or that participant to answer a question in a certain way. And that's why it's really important that people who are doing this sort of research are actual trained researchers, because we actually learn how to ask questions and how to avoid these things, or how to acknowledge them in reporting or disseminating our research. Okay, so that's a big, big deal. Um, I've done studies not just on trying to answer questions like these, but also on how we go about asking the questions to answer questions like these. Um, I've done studies asking, like, how does, a question response um, differ if all the demographic questions are at the beginning versus all the demographic questions being at the end, right? And so these things actually do matter. And the studies that are mentioned in your text in chapter 2 actually exemplify that. Another thing that um, could be happening that may lead to inconsistent results, or results that aren't absolute, is that when we're looking at some differences, have, having to differentiate. I'm trying to come up with so many different words for the word different at this point, but having to differentiate between those observations or those observed differences that are innate versus those that are the result of learned difference or socialization, something you've been taught, something that's an influence of your sociocultural environment or your social milieu. That is complicated and it's really difficult to extract those things from one another, and to single out what is learned and what is innate, right? And actually, it's impossible. Is kind of the argument that we make today, or that many of us make today, and that there are too many complications. There's too much complexity in there to make a definitive, slice between one category and another. Looking at definition number 2, your gender differences are real if they are observed in all or most contemporary and historical cultures. Um, yeah, no. Um, and we can see actual evidence that kind of would negate that um, there are differences that are the same across every culture. Um, and a lot of what we view as being examples that might support this argument are really just looking at what's called a weird norm, right? Weird stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic norm. And so if we're comparing to cultures and nations that are similar to our own, okay, then yeah, maybe we could say, yeah, this is a real difference. But only 12% of the world population lives in a weird country, right? And even amongst, that 12%, we can oftentimes stick out a lot. But when we look at the global stage, when it comes to gender difference, sometimes we stick out like a sore thumb. Like we just stick out among the national. This is true when it comes to serial killers, and it's true when it comes to the gendering of mathematical success. Um, while we see studies that suggest that there are trends showing that boys do better than girls in math in K through 12 in school on average, most of that is only true if you're comparing boys to girls in their own country. So, what does that mean? There's a lot of research that's discussed in the text. Go read it. It's amazing. And especially if you've always like you grew up thinking, I'm not a math person or something like that, this is for you. Okay. But here's one example that's in your text. And this is that Japanese girls are better at math than American boys, right? Although they underperform their compared to their Japanese boy counterparts. And so let's focus on that, right? Not all girls are doing better than all boys, and not all boys are doing better than all girls, right? I think I said it backwards the first time. So I'm kind of trying to counter correct myself here. Um, and so if this were to be a true difference, then we should see it across the board everywhere, and we don't. Okay. And that's even in countries that are more similar to the United States or to our own than others. Um, where we're looking at this question, you also have to think about what doing well means as well. So going back into that conceptualization, and conceptualization means like understanding how we're measuring a concept or a variable, right? So in math, what is doing well, right? Because while boys are more likely to achieve top scores in math than girls, like be in the top 1%, they are also more likely to achieve low scores in math compared to girls. Okay, so which one is your measure of success? Is it what proportion is doing really well at one end of an extreme, or what proportion is doing really poorly at one end of the stream? Because those two ends of that are telling two different stories, right? If we're comparing just who's at the lowest levels, right, then it seems like girls are actually doing better than boys, right? And so again, it really just depends on how we're asking that question and how, perhaps what the perspective is of the person who's asking that question. And then where does intersectionality come in to influence these findings? We're going to talk about that more in a later slide here. But do these findings hold up when you're comparing US kids, like even within our own country, with different types of other US kids? So by race, by ethnicity, by income level, where do we see differences that might challenge that idea that it's purely a sex difference or gender difference that's making the difference. So yeah. So I think it's obvious that you know, perhaps math ability is more so about practice, right? Than anything else. And so maybe we should be asking the question, who gets the greatest chances to practice? Who's expected to practice in this area of study the most? Um, and who is encouraged to practice the most? So, I mean, who would have thunk it? Who would have thought that, the more you do something, the better you might be at it? Amazing, novel idea, right? Isn't that much like more pragmatically, like, I don't know, doable than trying to overcome your gender or sexuality? Um, Sorry, not sexuality, your gender or your sex identity. Like, maybe it's just as simple as if you study more, you'll do better. So, yeah. Okay, so definition three is one of my favorites. It's that gender differences are real if they are biological. And I like that your text breaks it up and it's asking you, okay, let's look at biological functions and let's see which biological functions may contribute to gender difference, if any. And so it starts like with looking at genes, then it goes into hormones, and then it goes into the brain, and so on and so forth. And so here is where, again, we find a whole lot of difference as well. Um, and I kind of just like love the way that this is presented, logically and convincingly once again. So when it comes to genes, some may be expressed only in male or female type like bodies, right? So for example, everyone has breasts, both those who have been assigned male or female sex at birth, but not everyone can breastfeed. And this is true not just by gender difference, right? Not just like, yeah, it's more likely that women will, or those who are sexually assigned female at birth, will breastfeed, right? But not all women can breastfeed. And we have seen examples where men, those who have been assigned male at birth, have been able to breastfeed. And then going beyond the assigned at birth, obviously, we can see that people who are non-binary or transgender would also be able to say, yes, I'm a man who can breastfeed, or look, I'm a woman who has no ability to breastfeed in any way, shape, or form, just based on those identities alone. Um, so yeah, there are exceptions all over for that. The chromosome story, it was so fun because while I've done research on intersex variation, I didn't realize that you only needed an X chromosome to survive. So having an X chromosome is super helpful for survival, and having only a Y chromosome, survive, right? You're not going to survive, and so that's really interesting to look at. And in fact, the XY combination actually makes you more susceptible to these recessive traits like colorblindness. This I did know, and this most of us are aware of. And so these recessive traits maybe aren't picked up. And so they end up becoming these gender nuances, right? But does it really mean much difference? Not really. Um, I don't think so. I think it just means that, some things are accessible in a different way for some people than other, but not necessarily does it have any meaningful connection to being male or female or being a woman or a man. So chromosomes themselves, it doesn't seem like chromosomes and genetics actually do more than really just determining our reproductive organs to some extent and producing our hormone profiles, which next, um, hormones are these, chemicals and message responses in the body that carry instructions for our basic physiological processes, like our reproductive cycles, our moods, our aggression, our hunger, all of these things. And the important thing to know here is that all hormones circulate in all bodies. However, there may be different proportions, but they're all in all bodies. We're not opposite sexes. We don't have opposing hormones. Contrary to what is taught in schools, like saying that men produce this and women produce this hormone, we all have all the hormones. But the amount or the uptake, right, whether our bodies actually acknowledge and put those hormones to use, respond to them, that differs. And it could differ by sex or gender, but it can also differ just by your environment as well. So go back into the text again, amazing examples of how, you know, our hormones can create these different personality traits, right? That aren't necessarily gendered traits, right? But they're just linked to that hormone. And this can contribute to what we view, right, with our perceived reality as a gender difference, but really it's more so a hormonal difference, right? And so, what are the things that can influence, like, for example, greater testosterone uptake in women and lower testosterone uptake in men? So, yeah, the chapter goes into a lot of additional examples. And then the same thing with brains, right? So, for example, women have smaller brains on average because women typically have smaller bodies. And there might be some variation in white and gray matter in some regions of the brain, but the findings are basically nothing to write home about. There's no difference between our levels of intelligence based on gender and brain, like size and composition. Um, and so I love this statistic, and if you need context for it, go read the reading. But 97.6% of us have gender non-conforming brains. I thought that was brilliant. That our brains don't conform to a binary. That when they tried to find all male exclusive brains and all female exclusive brains, they found like a very tiny proportion of brains seem to have the same profile within the same sex. And so for the most part, our brains vary so much within our genders and sexes that it doesn't even there's no such thing as a male or a female brain, right? Um so this is really pushing this concept of mutability, which I like, because we can't really tell what these differences do most of the time, or if they're even significant. Like if they're significantly impacted by the actual biology alone, right? That these things are changing constantly, that they're influenced by our environments, and that they're influenced by our culture as well. And so that's where we get into the last definition, where we're looking at gender differences being real if they are biological and immutable, right? So mutable means changing, influenced by our socio-biological environments. Then immutable means that, okay, so these differences are real because they're permanent and they can't be influenced by nurture, basically. And unfortunately, or fortunately, this is not something that we can declare, right? And then your chapter goes into next talking about our similarities and what causes our similarities. Basically, that our differences are mutable and that they are influenced greatly by not just biology alone, but also by culture and our social environment, and that it's not like 20% of this nature and 80% of this like social environment or nurture, right? But instead it's an integrated um complex matrix, right, of socio biological elements. So we'll go into that next. So yeah, there are differences, but again, they're most likely mutable and complicated, right? And yeah, I'm going to use that word mutable a lot because that is my like new word power up. I just got double HP XP for that. They're certainly not opposite, right? Our differences aren't opposite in most every way. We find that men and women are more alike than we are different. and that you can get rid of the men are from Mars and women are from Venus or whatever. These ideas of being opposite and different are most likely being used as excuses for purporting the status quo, right? And so, what's really going on here is this biosocial interaction, which requires that we reject nature and we reject nurture as being standalone explanations, right? So, with rejecting nature or naturalism, right, we're rejecting the idea that biology and environment affect our behavior independently, right? That they're not working together in a chorus to impact us. You can't measure, how we're being affected only by biology and how we're being affected only by environment, because our environment impacts our biology and our biology impacts our environment. You can't separate those two things. We also have to reject this nurture argument, right? That says that most of this is caused by our socialization and by learning alone, that we're just blank slates and then we pour, like sand into a glass or something like that, because it's not true, right? Um, I have long been a supporter of um, the nature and nurture argument, that's saying it's both and simultaneously all the time, everywhere, right? Sex and gender are products of both nature and nurture, and we have to acknowledge that. One of the ways that we acknowledge it in this text is by looking at biocultural interaction, or this process by which our bodies respond to our cultural environment and our cultural environments respond to our bodies as well, right? So, what does that look like? Right. What's the long story short here? Because again, in your text, there is a more longer, a drawn out way of describing this. But what we're allowed and encouraged to do in our lives, in society, both socially and physically,